Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be moderating this panel, and I would like to acknowledge how fantastic it is that STM and the leadership here has recognized the need to diversify the program. And so I think it's fantastic that we're seeing a mix of representatives up here today on the dais. So thank you to STM for choosing to have this discussion. The title of our session is Diversity to Improve Scholarly Research. And this asserts a principle that I hope we can all get behind, that diversity and inclusion will help all of our organizations to be more productive and more effective. We had a chance, we have 3 panelists here today. I'll introduce them in a moment, and actually one joining us on Skype due to yet another tropical storm in the United States, in the Gulf of the United States. We can talk about climate change later. So she was unable to make her flight. But when we all spoke in advance, everyone stressed that increasing diversity is a critical objective for each of the organizations represented here. And I'm sure it is in yours. And I think that's why we see so many interested people in the room here today. Diversity and inclusion are worthy pursuits in their own rights, but they are also business imperatives. And I think that is a really important point for us to think about. The commercial aspects of this are extremely important as well, and we're going to touch on a few of those topics. But let me begin by introducing our panelists, beginning with Gemma Hersh, who is Vice President of Open Science at Elsevier. In the United Kingdom, she sits as the publisher representative on the university's UK Open Access Monitoring Group, and before joining Elsevier, she was head of public affairs for the UK Publishers Association. I'm sure you know her well. Next to Gemma is Mandy Hill, who is the managing director of academic publishing at Cambridge University Press. And before joining CUP in 2014, Mandy worked for Oxford University Press for over 15 years. To the left of Mandy is Leon Heward-Mills, who is the global publishing director at Taylor & Francis Group, leading editorial development and strategy across Taylor & Francis journals. Between 2011 and 2015, Leon was chief executive of the Society for Endocrinology and managing director at Bioscientifica, the society's commercial subsidiary. And joining us today on Skype is Sonya Smith, who joined the Howard University faculty in 1995. She is the first tenured female faculty member in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. She recently became the first woman promoted to the highest academic rank of full professor in this department. Later this month in Washington, Professor Smith is leading the Women in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Conference for women professionals, faculty, and researchers from the United States and South Africa. Sonya, are you hearing us okay?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just perfectly. Fantastic. Glad it's working. Very good. Well, please join me in welcoming our panelists. So a couple of things. I have lots of things to share with you here. Actually, behind us, you will see a few points on a slide that the panelists agreed on. We thought it would be important to frame this for you as a very broad conversation. Diversity is actually a big topic, actually, here at the Frankfurt Book Fair. This is my second talk today on diversity, and we are not limiting the frame here to gender diversity, for example. We're talking about the breadth of issues with regard to diversity and inclusion. So hopefully the bullets you see up on the slide will help give you a frame for your questions, and we will be taking questions at the end of the panel. So let me start off by talking about diversity at the highest level. So it is not a single pursuit, but it's a series of them. Gender, culture, socioeconomic, racial diversity. How do you define diversity, and how do you define success with achieving it? Would you like to start us off, Gemma?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, Tracy.
So the dictionary, sorry, can you hear me okay?
Sorry.
The dictionary definition of diversity is literally that, lots of different things. And I think we've captured some, but I would say not all of the elements of diversity on the list behind us. Many of us could add others to that. We were talking beforehand around things like gender fluidity and sexuality and other areas of diversity that are really important. There are lots of ways of measuring how diverse an organisation is, and setting targets and reaching certain targets is one way of doing that. My personal view is that actually achieving diversity, there'll never be an end point. It is a continuing, evolving spectrum of diversity. Society continues to change over time, and any company that wants to remain competitive and attractive will need to be continuously cognizant of its workforce and its pool of potential applicants, and also the customers that it's serving.
Excellent points.
Yeah, in terms of the question about what does success look like, and in an ideal world, we shouldn't need to have a panel like this because it should be a non-issue, but really to be able to measure it, as an organisation, our workforce should mirror the potential workforce in the community at all levels. That's where we want to get to, so that when we look at the people we have in our organisation, the makeup of our teams really reflects everybody that we would want to be able to bring in the wider workforce. That's what we should be aiming for.
Yeah, thanks, Mandy. And really, I think, there's always a so what aspect to all of this, but I think for any company that is operating globally, it is critical for a company that wants to operate in global markets that it has the right sort of mix to ensure that it reflects the customers that we're working with. I like the fact that we're talking about diversity, but we're also talking about inclusion. The diversity piece is clear. I think when we talk about inclusion, I think about creating an environment where everybody can contribute. I think that that's critical because that will lead to business success by definition. And I think that you've always got to frame it in that so what, with that so what aspect in mind. But on the other hand, I think there's also a moral imperative as far as fairness is concerned as well. Success, yes, absolutely, when we don't need to talk about it anymore. But I agree with the point around this spectrum. Things will always change. And, we'll talk about millennials later. We'll talk about working with younger people as well. And I often use family members to illustrate talks that I make, which is a huge mistake on my part. But I've got my son, yeah, okay, I'll come back to that one. But my son, who is a 20-year-old engineering undergrad, the way that he approaches work, the way that he approaches inclusion, it's entirely different to the way that I was 20 years ago. It's an entirely different mix. It's an entirely different approach. So I think that, success is coming up fast, but we can't be complacent because there are lots of really big issues that we've got to address in order to get anywhere near that success that we're talking about, frankly.
Well, I can relate, Leon. I often use the examples in my family as well, so I think it's just fine. And speaking of working frequently with millennials and younger people, Sonya, I think you can share some insight from that dimension because you're doing that every day at Howard University. So we would welcome your thoughts on this.
Yes. My thoughts about how I define diversity and inclusion is also what I would add to what the other speakers have contributed, but also informs of research as the people who participate in academic research become more diverse on one axis. New forms of research, new forms of disciplines of study also arise. And so with that, there needs to be some method to include those research disciplines, those research themes into the broader conversation. For example, intersectionality is a hot topic right now, particularly research about women of color in the academy. In those studies, there needs to be a diversity of outlets for that type of research, and that needs to be valued. As far as success, I would also agree with the other panelists that it's a continuum, that we will continue to have these conversations as more and more people and more branches to a mechanism that includes and values all those things as they arise.
Sonya, do you think that the students is it your experience that the students have a less cynical view, and in their initiation of some of these new areas of academic research and study, are they hitting any barriers, and are they surprised by those barriers? In other words, are they living in a situation in their academic world that has a different complexion when it comes to inclusion and diversity? And then when they cross over into either graduate studies or into the commercial environment, that they are surprised with the barriers that they encounter. What's your experience there?
I think the students, millennials, and beyond are much more comfortable than, I'll say myself, us older folks at working in interdisciplinary, working at the edges of different disciplines. So when they move, they have ideas that they want to pursue, and when they move to graduate school and want to pursue those, there may be an issue as to where they fit. And particularly when it's time to publish the work, it's like, where does this thing that I'm doing that's great and I'm having great results, and where does this fit into the traditional publishing world and traditional journals? And so I think, they're much more comfortable at the creation and ideation part of that, and diversity of thought, but I think we have a way to catch up with them as to where they can present, publish, and where their scholarship can be included.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that we talked about in our preparation for this panel was talent. And I think a lot of the millennials that Sonya was just referring to are the future talent that you hope to employ. And I thought we would talk to the panel here about their experience in recruiting. Who are your companies competing with for talent? And what does that patchwork quilt of companies and that ecosystem, how does that influence your need to transform your organization to be more inclusive and more diverse, so that this talent is willing to come and work for you, interested in coming, compelled to come and join your employee group? So Leon, could you talk about that? Because I think when we think about this from a business imperative perspective, attracting talent, what's more important than that?
Exactly.
Retaining it, I guess.
Yeah, attracting and retaining. And I think that, again, looking back at how things used to be, there was a really set career path. My career has been established in the UK, always worked within a global environment, but within a publishing environment. It was very, very traditional. It started, for those who come out from the UK, with a job ad in the Guardian, and it went on from there. That's how it used to be. And in terms of the questions that I was asked when I first came into publishing, they were very mundane, but it's entirely different now. And I think, as you say, thinking about talent, but thinking about where we're going to operate and who we're competing with, we are all becoming technologists now. So we are competing with those who are looking at the large technology firms, looking at the entrepreneurial startup environment, and thinking about how, what is it like working in that. So I think we have to really rethink our whole strategy as far as talent acquisition is concerned. As far as we're concerned, there are a couple of key measures that we use, and we use at TNF to try and ensure that we are encouraging the brightest and the best, and that they will stay with us. I think having open, honest discussions. We talked about millennials before, and I think in particular the honesty that the millennial group expect is something that is very different. They're far more demanding than perhaps we were 20, 30 years ago. I think we also have to bear in mind that the pool that we're picking from is global as well. So we need to make sure that we're not just looking at this from an Anglo-Saxon Eurocentric point of view. We've got massive potential for growth in Asia Pacific. So we're looking at how we're engaging with markets, how we're engaging with people there. So it's really shaking up the whole approach that we're taking. But I think simple things hold true. Clarity of purpose, flexibility as well, flexibility around work, whether it's variation within the role or thinking about alternative roles as well. And again, to give an example from a couple of years ago, I worked in a medical organization, as you've already said, Tracy, and I remember going into that environment and thinking about, what could we do to broaden the talent pool. We had a very particular way of operating, but we weren't as represented in senior level female roles as we ought to have been. So simple things just like changing the balance around work life, changing the balance around job flexibility meant that we had some massive immediate wins because we got people working with us who, frankly, we couldn't have afforded otherwise. So there's a real benefit, but I think it's about being open. I think it's about being clear, and it's about having a clarity of purpose and actually a strategy for dealing with this as well. So I think that would be my starter for 10.
Yeah, that's a great starter, I think. So Gemma, at Elsevier, you certainly are attracting a lot of technologists and data scientists and people with a whole new sets of skill sets coming out of university, and then needing to retain them. So you must be competing with the top tech companies here for talent. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely, as you rightly say, and I recognise much of what Leon has said too, as we really grow to become an information analytics company, we are competing with Google, Facebook, Apple for technologists, engineers, and frankly with, as you described, the millennials who come to expect something from a company that they want to work in, a company that adheres to certain responsibilities and uses its role in that way. And I think there's both an internal piece and an external piece to what Elsevier does, and through its parent company Relics as well. So for example, we look from a publishing perspective at things like diversity on editorial boards and what we can do in that regard. At a company level as well, we are part of the EDGE program, which many of you may be familiar with. It's a global standard for businesses to measure themselves against in terms of how they're doing on diversity issues. It's specifically focused on gender diversity, and you have independent audits of your company on things like flexible working and pay and so on. And we actually have just reached the first level of certification on that, which is really, really good. So lots of internal things doing there as well. But I think we also have a lot of in-house expertise that we can contribute to these types of discussions. So many of you may have seen that we put out a report on gender in the global research landscape using our analytics capabilities and a methodology that we developed through Scopus to shine a light on what's happening in gender in research. So creating a pool of data, not necessarily suggesting any policy recommendations from that, but making that data available, doing qualitative and quantitative analysis to help inform discussions around sort of the leaky pipeline that you described earlier, where more women in research, but across a whole range of organisations, come in at a certain level, and you get say there's 55% of the workforce at Elsevier is female, but when you go up the chain, it's about 30% in senior leadership positions. And what can we do about that, and what do we know about that as a first start?
That's an excellent point, and I think we should get to the complexion of leadership and how that how the workforce responds to that and the talent attraction. So maybe we'll get to that in a moment. Mandy, could you elaborate on the talent at Cambridge? What are you doing to attract talent and retain them?
Yeah, and I think, obviously Cambridge is a traditional organisation, and we're in a part of the country where we are not surrounded by other publishers. So we are definitely competing with non-publishers to attract our talent. And that is a challenge for us. And I think particularly, just as was said earlier, the skills we're trying to attract are not necessarily traditional publishing skills. So how do we attract people in? We're obviously, like everybody, looking to publish more and more STM content. So you're looking to get people from STM backgrounds with new skills. That's a challenge. How do we do it? I think it's changing the way we're advertising. We're doing some simple things now in terms of training our recruiters, making sure that they're going through unconditional bias training to make sure people aren't bringing in sort of unconscious bias into the interviews. We're looking even at how many women are in the first interview rounds compared to the number of men, to make sure that we're actually bringing in the right quotas. I mean, quotas is the wrong word because you don't want it to be a quota system. Just looking at the numbers at the interview levels, and simple being aware of who we're trying to attract, how we're trying to attract them, and actually starting to measure it, which is something I don't think we've ever done before. But in terms of attracting talent, I think it is a challenge for us in terms of how we're perceived as an organisation, but I think broader than that, actually as an industry. You know, the types of people who want to come into publishing historically have been of a certain type of, you know, we look around the room and we're probably, many of us of similar backgrounds. We've gone through university, we've come out, thought, what should we do, go into publishing. We don't necessarily now want to be attracting people who are thinking that way. We want to be attracting people who are coming from a slightly different mindset in the first place, who perhaps haven't actually even thought about publishing, and those are the very people we want to be attracting to our organisations. So how do we do that? That is a challenge for us all, I think. But coming on to the point, though, that Gemma was making about senior leaders, I think, and women, I think one of the issues is women going on maternity leave, taking a career break, and then because the industry is changing so fast, they're finding it hard to come back into the industry again. They're feeling that their skills are no longer relevant. So how can we make it easier for women to come back into an organisation after they've had a few years as a career break? And I think looking at how we offer flexible working, but also training to enable people to come back in effectively, because I think there's a nervousness sometimes, women seeing how much the organisation and the industry has changed and feel that they might not be equipped, or they might feel they're going to have to go back in at a lower level and they're not feeling comfortable with that. So how can we make sure they don't feel like they're disadvantaged in coming back? They can actually come back in strongly in a way that's going to work for them. So I think that's incredibly important as we do try to ensure that the numbers of women at higher levels reflects the overall workforce.
Actually, as studies show, in a very recent study just conducted this year by an executive firm, the executive search firm found that it was around age 32 that the career break typically occurs. And that's when the pay gap actually comes into play because of the delayed reentry and often extended delayed reentry due to the factors you just described. And it's a very, I think, a tactic that we might think about as an industry, especially for companies large enough to afford it, are reentry programs. Yeah. Explicit reentry programs for both men and women who are taking, women and men, I should say it that way, because more women are probably taking that break now, but why is it just women, right? Let us remember to include paternity leave, occasionally anyway. Sonya, I think you could really help inform us as somebody who's working with the talent of the future that we are trying to attract. And so we heard you make some comments about the new forms of research and the value that you hope will be placed on this research as we go forward. How can we best prepare ourselves as an industry to attract the type of talent that you're exposed to every day in your community?
Well, thanks. I think it will take engagement because if you're trying to attract data scientists, engineers, computer scientists, et cetera, the people in my world to academic publishing, they have to first think that that's a thing that they can do, that that's an option for them. And quite often they're not thinking about that. So I think it will take engagement at recruitment fairs and continued engagement with academic institutions and organizations, professional organizations, to sort of sensitize the talent to say, yes, this is an option for you, and here's why, and these are the benefits. quite often that's not the case. The students don't think of publishing as a career for them coming out of engineering school or a graduate program in engineering or computer science or data science. A few years back, I was producing engineers, computational scientists, and they were being snapped up by Wall Street, as fast as we could as fast as we could make them. And that was due to a concerted effort by the banks to court that talent. And I think something very similar will be needed in academic publishing in order to make sure that that's a first consideration for some of these students.
So a partnership, for example, in a public-private partnership where we're partnering with universities and developing these skills and programs together with universities to help the students understand expose them to the possibilities in terms of the future ahead. Sorry, I thought it was a question, but I don't think I phrased it enough like a question.
But I think Tracy as well, there's a point on the recruitment aspect as well and what companies do there. But on the retention point, there's a big thing about the culture of an organisation. One thing that struck me when I first joined Elsevier, I'd come from jobs where I'd spent about 2.5 years and then moved to different roles. And when I joined Elsevier and I asked practically everybody that worked there, how long have you worked there for? Years. Long time. And I do think that much of that is to do with the culture of an organisation, and particularly what we were talking about earlier with flexible working and women. Even at the senior leadership levels, there is, I certainly have the sense of complete buy-in around diversity and inclusion. On a Wednesday afternoon, if you want to schedule a call with somebody in Amsterdam that is female or even male, there's an expectation that Wednesday afternoon is a day, I think in the Netherlands, where kids are off school early or off nursery or whatever. A lot of people take that day off. It's just no question that's part of the course. And it's about the culture of an organisation as well, where things like that are very much accepted.
Mm.
Sorry, my connection was lost. I'm back. This is Sonya.
Oh, very good. Okay, I'm sorry we lost you, but I'm relieved that I wasn't. I thought I was talking to myself for a minute. Yeah, go ahead, Mandy, and Leon, if you want to weigh in. Yeah.
I think, talking about retention, I think it's also about how we develop people, and one aspect of people development is around having mentors for staff that you're hoping to see progress through the organisation, and I think having people that the more junior people can relate to and feel are relevant role models is a challenge sometimes in an organisation. I've had this in our New York office, where talking to some of the junior team, and they were saying, looking at the senior leadership, you don't look like us, you don't feel like us, you might not be the mentors we're looking for. And for us as an organisation of our size, to think about how do we provide mentors who feel right to our teams, who are going to make them feel that academic publishing and Cambridge University Press is something they want to stay in. I think that's a challenge for us to make sure that what the senior leadership team looks like doesn't stop people feeling that this is an organisation and an industry that they can grow up in.
So yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points. Firstly, just not to underestimate, I guess, the difficulty of this. I know no one is underestimating the difficulty of this, because I think that we are seeing we're seeing changes occurring across the industry and across all industries as far as diversity is concerned, but also in terms of the expectation of the workforce. I think that the key to this, because also, if we talk about retention and talk about what we're looking to do from an employer point of view, we want to ensure that we retain the best people. We also want to ensure that we're not creating division as well. And I think that the collaboration and actually seeing how you can use diversity as a way, initiatives in diversity as a way of demonstrating business growth, as we've got on the screen behind us, is really important. But it's really important too to bring as many people with you as possible. And I think just thinking about, so I was writing down some of the initiatives that we do within TNF and Informa, I think that sometimes initiatives are doomed to failure if we're repeating what we have done over the last 10, 20 and 30 years, and we're approaching it with a top-down approach. And I think a lot of the examples we've heard aren't looking to do that. I think there's a real risk if we impose and say, this is what you have to do, then those who aren't in the minority are going to turn off to it. I think that that's one of the biggest risks about this whole conversation, and why sometimes we don't do much about it, and why we sometimes feel a little bit awkward about it as well, because certainly we don't, I think in the UK, we don't like to address it head on, and it does need addressing head on. So I'd make that point first of all. I think secondly, to add to the difficulty, and it leads to the point around retention as well, but it's also what we expect from the academic sector that we're working with. It's really encouraging hearing what Sonya's saying around initiatives that are coming out of the States. In the UK, initiatives like the Athena Swan initiative, looking to ensure we have something like equity as far as gender is concerned. And I'm focusing, what I'm saying now around gender is really strong and really important. But again, thinking about case studies and thinking about examples I know from researcher friends, researcher colleagues who've talked to me about in recent times, about the extraordinary challenges that there are on the researcher who's taking that career gap, who's looking at what their level of contribution is to a particular researcher team, and how that is not recognised if they've taken 2-3 years out. Just focusing on this, I think, is really difficult, because that is the prism through which we look at all of this at the moment, whilst we're working so closely with academia. So I think that's a key point as well. But then the final point I wanted to make was around the mentor piece, but also around examples. And we run a program called All Informa, which does exactly that, looks at how we can recognize women in leadership. And the initiatives that we've picked up on in 16 and 17 have led with gender diversity initially. And it does come up with some excellent examples of women in leadership, but we're now moving towards getting examples and getting interviews with millennials as well. So it's not so much a mentorship type approach, it's actually a case study approach. So just stick it, these are people who you can engage with, you can work with. Here are some good examples. And as far as our intranet is concerned, these are the intranet pages that have the highest level of engagement across the organization. So, something right is happening there. But I think just throwing in that warning around, not quite initiative fatigue, but the doing stuff rather than just coming up with the plan, which we're all guilty of, I think, is really key.
Right, so a lot of studies, but action is, we really need action.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jen.
And I guess that's an opportune time to talk about the work that the Publishers Association is doing at the moment, which I think is really excellent. Their inclusivity agenda, where they have a 10-point plan around inclusion, having a system where we can do that collectively as an industry, think about admittedly from a UK perspective, how the publishing workforce reflects the UK population. So frankly, it's not acceptable that 13% of the UK publishing workforce is from a BAME background. The acronym that's used for Black and Minority Ethnic, 13% is not ethnically diverse. Having good statistics in that way through the PA, which will be an annual process of looking at that, a 10-point plan that all members, including ourselves, can sign up to and have signed up to, that looks at things like audits around your processes, what you're doing by way of diversity and inclusion plans to address that, I think takes you a good step towards actual concrete action.
Yeah, and 13% is all that is diverse.
May I follow up on the mentor piece just for a second?
Yes, please, Sonya.
Sure. I think it's important that we also understand that we have an obligation to educate the mentees as well, because a good mentor is a good mentor, and that good mentor or successful mentor doesn't necessarily have to come from your demographic. Some of the best mentors that I've had have not been from my demographic or gender. And some of the most challenging mentor situations I've been in have been in same gender and same demographics. So I think it's important that we identify good mentors, period, and and educate both mentors and mentees to accept that. The other thing I wanted to say is, as far as retention, it's very important that you not only have mentorship, but you also have a sponsor. And that person is not the person that's going to meet with you every week, but that's the person that can help you move through the organization and get the opportunities that you need for visibility. So I think it's both mentorship and sponsorship that we have to promote for new hires in order to retain them in any industry.
Excellent comments. I just wanted to build on Leon's comment that this problem feels very difficult, and we are respecting that it is and embracing it. And I had recently read that the Global Gender Gap Report, focusing on gender for a moment, in 2016, published by the World Economic Forum, cited that given the widening economic gender gap, parity between the sexes will, quote, not be closed for another 170 years. So I think we have a lot more STM programs, Darrell, that we need to be working on. And this is despite the fact that in 95 countries, women attend universities in equal or higher number than men. So I think that's a pretty startling finding. I do think that the engagement programs that we talked about here, getting active, having the mentors is very important. One point, just building on the comment that you made, Gemma, about the diversity and the BAME acronym, actually, that you educated me on. I had never heard the acronym before, and in preparing for the panel, as we wanted to discuss a broad range of diversity and inclusion topics, we actually asked ourselves, how should we talk about some of these topics? I mean, we can easily say gender diversity, but when it comes to, for example, racial diversity, we don't want to offend anybody. We want to use the right and appropriate language, and that actually varies in different parts of the world. And I think we actually were thinking that it might be hard for you to ask a question on this because you might feel, oh my gosh, what should I say? I would typically say a person of color, but that wouldn't be what you would say. And so we were educating each other about how we would each reference these topics. And I think the fact, someone said the fact that we're having this panel, I think Mandy said is sort of a big deal. And that the panel, in order to have a panel, we actually had to prepare and make sure that we were on the same page about language. And so I think that's really illustrating how deep-seated these issues are. So I would welcome any thoughts. Maybe we start with Sonya and then we go to Gemma and Mandy. Sonya, do you have any thoughts on that? Do we have Sonya?
Yes, I'm here. We're reconnecting again. No, I do think that, the pre-discussion that we had on coming to common language and what the issues are was important. This is a very difficult problem, and it's something that the industry and, our various organizations, countries, et cetera, will have to make a conscious effort to work on to, achieve what is going to be an answer that we can live with. Will we achieve perfect parity? No. It's something that we'll live with.
Whoop, I think we lost the connection. So, Mandy, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a challenge for us all, but one that we have to face up to. I think the worst thing we can do now is, just because the conversation might be challenging, is to not have that conversation. If we're not sure how to go about having a conversation and what terminology to use, we should ask. And we should, maybe some junior managers will want training on the conversations, or I don't know, but I think the worst thing that we as an industry can do is not talk about these things, because we have to engage with the issue, really think about how we can ensure that by having conversations, by talking to people about how do we attract the talent? Well, we need to be able to talk to the talent.
Yes.
That's part of the challenge. So we can't just avoid it. So I think it is about being really honest about it and having an honest and open conversations.
Yes, I live in a country where we talk about which bathroom to use, and gender fluidity is a topic that we raised here earlier in the discussion, and with our millennial and our colleagues in the room. I mean, there are, we are just let's find common ground, common language, respectful language, and inclusive language, and inclusive behaviors, and move forward. But I am now turning into a panelist. Oh my gosh, I'm breaking all the rules. Gemma.
Really, I was just going to echo what's been said. Actually, in many parts of the world, I understand from colleagues, it's illegal to ask somebody what their ethnic background is, which makes it extremely difficult to be able to benchmark and capture sort of where you are and where you need to go to. However, that should not be an excuse for us not having the conversation. We all have eyes and can look around the room and see for ourselves what diversity looks like. The other point I'd also make is it's sometimes interesting to see there's an economic imperative argument, which we've discussed, but sometimes a political imperative. So a lot of focus in the UK around the fact that companies now have to report the gender pay gap. And I'm sure that focuses all of our companies' minds around what that looks like when those figures are made public and so on. And I understand that there is a report out today, or there will be a report launched today in the UK around ethnic diversity and opportunities for people from ethnic backgrounds. So it'll be interesting to see how the narrative shifts to focus on diversity in a different way to perhaps we've discussed it for the majority of the time today.
Yes, excellent. Well, could you share some examples
Sonya.
of
I'm sorry.
how...
Sorry, Sonya.
Oh, Sonya, I'm sorry. Were you trying to say something, Sonya?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I got disconnected again. However, the point that I was making when I was cut off is that I think it's important that we have that we continue to have a conversation, because all of the issues around diversity are not immediately identifiable. So, for example, differently abled people a lot of times in order to capture their demographics, they have to self-identify. They're not necessarily some are not necessarily willing to do that because they don't feel like there's a safe space in the organization for them to identify that. So we have to not only have these conversations, they have to be ongoing, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, but also making sure that we understand that the language and the identifiers are fluid.
I think, Gemma, you made a point I think at the very beginning, I made a note, there's never an end point, and society is continuing to change. I think we really need to keep that in mind, and I think Sonya is reminding us of that in her comments. Leon.
So yeah, just a quick point, and going back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, which is it is difficult, of course it is, but I guess we always have to frame it in the so what. Why are we looking to do this? What is the purpose of having these conversations? So on the one hand, it is about inherent fairness and making sure that we are being fair as organizations and so forth, and we have a moral duty to do this, I believe. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, there's the commercial imperative as well. And I think that it's always going to be a difficult conversation to have. It's always going to be a difficult discussion to have. I think if we try and frame it in terms of what the benefits are for us as organizations, in terms of our reach, in terms of our global operations and so forth, I think that will make it easier to have these conversations and these discussions.
And Kim, I was just going to ask a question about the experience in your own companies, and also on the context of STM. Here we are today at the STM conference. Do we think STM publishers are doing enough when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and what else could they be doing? And why is it a business imperative to continually change our organizations and our approach to inclusion and diversity? Would you like to start us off with some thoughts on what your organization is doing and what other organizations could be thinking about, and why it is a commercial imperative?
Certainly. I think to your question, are we doing enough? I think no. I think we're not doing enough because I think we're not clear about what the end point is, and obviously this is going to be fluid and it's going to continue. I also think we're not doing enough because there is plenty else going on as well at the moment. So we're operating with many other drivers coming in, many other reasons why we're focusing our attentions elsewhere. But in a way, that is why it is a critical time to grasp this one and really do something about it. Because if you think about how the industry is going, how we're going to really be reinventing ourselves, if you like, at the center of the researcher ecosystem, having conversations that are to the one rather than to the many, you know, and trying to focus on this, then how we engage with those markets, how we engage with them internationally is going to become increasingly important. So to your point, I don't think the industry as a whole is doing enough about this. I think, you know, as was being said, kudos to STM for doing this after last year's meeting. I think it's a really important and valuable thing to do, just to raise the awareness and ensure that we are having the conversations. I think from an individual organization's point of view, though, I could certainly list a range of TNF and Informer initiatives. I won't, because it'll be quite tedious to do that. But as a clear example, I think one of the things I would say is that, you know, we're moving away from this idea of bringing in interns, and we're moving towards working with apprentices. So what do I mean by that, for those who don't use the same terminology? So rather than perpetuating the demographic that we have by ensuring that we're getting low-paid people in to work and get experience of work who can afford to do so because they come from a particular socioeconomic background or because they happen to know somebody who works within the organization, we're looking at actually making sure that we pay reasonably. And this is something that we have to do now, but it is something that makes absolute sense, because we're talking about the talent pool. We're talking about where we're going to fish, where we're going to make sure that we get the best talent. And if we're restricting that to a group that had all the opportunities, that we're able to go to the best universities and so forth, certainly in the UK, then that
Sort of the friends and family network.
It's the friends and family. We've all used it.
Yes.
And, you know,
Yes.
but I think it is something that doesn't take us forward. And when we think about just the final point, when we think about the global organizations that we're working with, and certainly the global reach that we're trying to perpetuate as far as research is concerned, that just doesn't cut it anymore. So we've got to think much more smartly about how we reach the folks who are going to be engaging with our content, either as the public, either as patient groups, and as researchers as well. And I think that takes a different
And can I
approach.
just ask a quick follow-up on the apprentice program that you have? I think Sonya was talking about the need for sponsors in addition to mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And is there some sort of a buddy system with the apprentice, that there's because it would seem to me that your existing staff could learn as much from the apprentice as the apprentice is learning from your team.
Absolutely. And to be fair, when we've brought in early career researchers or others to work with us, that's been the approach that we've always taken. It has to be a two-way thing, and with a mentor-mentee relationship, as has been said, the mentor and the mentee should get as much out of that relationship. We've not done that, but that is something that I think is absolutely imperative.
A nice way to build on that.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for
Exactly.
sharing that very much. Mandy, what's happening at Cambridge?
I mean, I think in terms of the question you asked a moment ago, are we doing enough? I think, you know, historically this has not been on the agenda for most publishers. But I do think, you know, for most of us now, over the past 18 months, 2 years, it's become a much bigger topic of conversation, and that's fantastic. But it's really only in that time frame we've started to think about what should we be doing. I think what's really important for me, though, is that, you know, as Leon said, there's so much that we're all grappling with here. This is an incredibly important topic for us. But what we mustn't do is think, okay, well, let's have a few activities so that we can tick this off our list and then move on and get on to other things. We've got to embed this into our very being. How do we work on an ongoing basis? And so this isn't going to be something that we can just do and get done. It's got to be sort of seen as a long-term program and something that really changes our very ways of working. I mean, I mentioned sort of the mentorships training that we've got. So the mentorship scheme, we've got the unconscious bias training. I think that's really key because most of us like to believe that we don't have bias in the way we think, but probably most of us, in fact, all of us do. And so how do we make sure we strip that out in our conversations, in our recruitment, in our development, in our selections? That's really key. I think in terms of, I mean, many companies in the UK are doing the apprenticeship scheme, so that's something, and I agree with Leon in terms of bringing in people from different pools is really important. So we've got network lunches, which is, again, really helpful in terms of just encouraging people to think differently about the opportunities within the organisation. So there's a combination of formal and informal work that's being done to really try and both bring in new people, but also ensure the development of the talent. And I think that for me, particularly on the gender equality, thinking about how we develop and retain people is incredibly important, because we are able to recruit women, to the point you made earlier. We're able to recruit women well. It's retaining them and seeing them move up the ranks that's the challenge.
Yes, and the re-entry piece we talked about before.
Absolutely.
Yes, great points. Gemma.
So really a very similar picture. I mentioned Edge Assess and that benchmarking program that has particularly focused Elsevier minds around what we're doing and what targets we want to set around things like flexible working and gender and diversity and gender pay and so on. And then sort of at a broader parent company level, at the RELX level, we're working on a diversity and inclusion strategy now that will incorporate a lot of what's been mentioned around identifying female candidates that have potential when they first enter the organisation and could reach senior leadership positions, and thinking about what mentoring and additional support they can be given to progress within the organisation. Our sister company, actually RBI, has signed up to a tech charter that does things that make sure that when you have shortlists for particular positions, there is always a female candidate on that shortlist. Now, that doesn't mean that the female candidate should get the job. It's based on merit. But again, it's to try and do things to address things like unconscious bias training that's been mentioned already. And also as a culture within the organisation, certainly within the time that I've been at Elsevier, there's been an increase in the amount of sort of spotlights and focuses and podcasts from senior leadership talking about diversity issues, which is really helpful for people at different levels within the organisation to see examples of people that have reached a certain position and are open about their sexuality or how they've dealt with things around their gender and a whole range of other issues, which is really helpful, I think, and it's that culture that engenders a lot of change as well.
Fantastic. Yes, Mandy.
One thing I was going to say, because I think most of us would not like to think, though, that the only reason that we'd got a job was because we're a woman or we're from a particular group. And I think the idea that women are made to feel that, I think you made the point earlier, Leon, that that feeling that there could be some positive discrimination in place, that people might be made to other people might feel negative about any programs because they think women are getting special treatment or whatever. That can have an incredibly negative impact for everybody. And I think it's really important with all of these programs, the point you made earlier, that there are programs for everybody. It's very clear that if you are having a program where you insist on a woman being in the shortlist, it's very clear that the best candidate is going to win. It's not going to be that you have to have an equal number of women getting posts. So you're not setting a quota that, from my point of view, a quota on the number of women in a board that's going to force the wrong decisions to be made about the best candidate. I think that's, again, in terms of difficult conversations to have, it's important that that's actually aired and we talk about that, because otherwise there can be a hidden feeling of, well, she only got the job because they needed to have a woman for their quotas. That's very unhealthy for everybody.
Well, in different parts of the world, that's certainly been approached very differently in different countries with mixed results. I think it is a very hot topic, so great for you to bring it up and call it to our attention. I'm going to ask Sonya for her thoughts, but as I do, I want to invite the audience to think about any questions, because I'll be coming out to you in just a moment. So if we can have the microphones ready for the folks who might want to ask a question for this fantastic panel. As the audience is thinking about their questions, Sonya, do you have any thoughts on what we as an industry could be doing better, what we're doing that's working? We're learning from you, and we would appreciate your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I think all of the approaches that have been articulated so far are fantastic, and particularly the unconscious bias training. That's something that we do here in academia. In the U.S., we have an advanced program sponsored by the National Science Foundation to increase the number of women in STEM, particularly on the faculty, and unconscious bias training and awareness training, as I like to say, is a key part of that. But one of the things that we find is that it can't be a one-off type of training. It needs to be coupled with something else. So you have the unconscious bias awareness training, but some approaches also have diversity advocates to work with search committees, hiring committees, just to make sure that there's a balance check on, the processes that are going on. So I think that everything that has been articulated is great, but but I think it just needs to be more of it and ongoing.
Very good. Thank you, Sonya. Sorry for the whole storm thing and this whole Skype thing, but you're a real trooper to do this with us, so thank you very much.
No, only my pleasure.
Thank you. Can I go to the audience and ask for any questions? Oh, great. We see some already.
Hi, I'm Phil DiVietro, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Thank you for a very smart, intelligent conversation today. I have two thoughts, and they're in parallel. It occurred to me many years ago that the entry-level talent that used to come to publishing kind of went to the dot-coms, kind of went to the Silicon Valley companies. The other thought I have is that I think our industry is considerably more diverse than Silicon Valley in the technology sector. There are some exceptions, and there's one who's pretty famous. Sheryl Sandberg's book is about 4 or 5 years old now. So my question to the panel is, beside the inspiration that somebody like Sheryl Sandberg might give us, is she just an exception in that industry? Is she a token? What's the thought in that context? Thank you.
She also has a new book out, actually. It's a light read, but it's a good read. So, would anybody?
Do you mind repeating the question? I
Yes.
could not hear it.
Very good. The question was from a colleague at the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, who was commenting that for a while he felt that we, the publishing industry, were losing talent to the dot-coms and the tech companies, and that we are more diverse, he feels, than many Silicon Valley companies. I hope I'm encapsulating this well. And he specifically remarked on Sheryl Sandberg, and I think was referencing her book Lean In from many years ago, and was asking the panel for our thoughts, your thoughts, on whether or not Sheryl Sandberg was a token, was the phrase he used, or otherwise. He was calling out Facebook as an exception because the COO is female. And of course, Silicon Valley, I think everyone in the room has probably read all of the dreadful news lately in terms of the gender pay gap issues and gender bias issues in Silicon Valley. Dark time for Silicon Valley. So a very timely question from our colleague. So
Thank you.
Sonya, why don't we go to you first and get your thoughts? If we can.
I don't think Sheryl Sandberg was actually a token. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay. I don't think she was a token, but I do think that if you look at her experiences and those of the few female COOs and CEOs at the Silicon Valley companies, their experiences are the same. And I think that we have to examine why. And I don't think it's that different from the experiences of women at the heads of many other large companies. And I think they experience the same biases, the same, and the same challenges as women along the other parts of the scale. So I think we need the same types of intervention and coaching, mentoring, et cetera, for them as well.
Very good. Would anyone at the table like to comment?
I mean, I would agree that the idea that she would have been a token, I'm sure that she wouldn't have recognised that term herself, because she had to work so incredibly hard to get to that position. So rather than sort of a token, which may be somebody who's been put into that position as a representative of, to be a woman on the board. But I think having people like that who are role models, I mean, what a fantastic role model she now is, but the industry and the wider society need to think about how hard it was for her to get there, what that means, and just as Sonya was saying, what that tells us that we need to address within our organisations. And whilst I agree we're much more diverse than the tech industries, we mustn't therefore think we're done. And we mustn't think that it's okay because they're in a worse place than us. They still do attract talent from us. There is a risk that if we don't really address the diversity issues in our organisations, we will continue to see talent go to the tech industry. We want people to be treated well wherever they go, clearly. And I think in the tech industry, they clearly have an awful lot of issues to resolve, and I hope they do. But in hoping that, I know that they're going to be even more likely to attract our talent. So there's even more incentive for us to really address the issues and ensure we do support diversity through all levels of our organisations.
Very good. Would you like to comment, or should we move on to another question? Okay, great. We have another question over here.
Hi, I'm Nancy Roberts from Business Inclusivity. I just wanted to ask a question that was more about salary, not specifically from the gender perspective, but from the industry perspective. So we've talked about some of the issues in attracting talent. It seems to me that until publishing is prepared to pay at the same rate that some of those tech companies are, it's always going to be a problem. I mean, I think for me in particular, if I'd been leaving university now with £50,000 worth of debt, publishing wouldn't have been a realistic career option. And I just wondered if anyone on the panel had thoughts about how we might address that. I mean, it's partly perception that people don't think publishing is well paid, but it's also partly truth. So how do we change that dynamic and attract people who want to pay off their debts and buy a house one day and maybe can't afford to live in London while they do that? I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Well, that's a real structural question. I'm sure there's companies here that would like to be able to make that change. Leon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to dodge the question in a way, but answer it in a different way, just by absolutely accepting that. But I think it is the case for many industries. Look, but I think the broader point is around reward in general. And I think if we're talking about millennials in particular and what it is that attracts them to a particular organization to work in it, of course, paying off that debt in the UK and in the US as well is a big issue. Worldwide, it's a big issue. I think, though, if we're really clear on the drivers and the values of the organization, coming into an organization now, and I have to say this in part because I have a new chief executive coming out of the technology sector who is female and is coming into our organization, is starting to shake us up in terms of the way that we think and the way that we take our approach to business, but is actually talking about values and talking about direction. And I think if we're clear about that, then I think some of those other points start to go away, actually. I think it is dodging the question because there is that £50,000, $50,000, whatever it is, debt that we will have to deal with. But I think that the drivers for millennials are, yes, it's about the money, but it's also about ensuring that you've got some clarity around purpose and values as well. So I think if we can get that right, and I think that this diversity conversation comes into that, then I think we'll be able to compete. And I just to say, I remember overhearing in the kitchen somebody at work, not at home, somebody talking about a recent entrant to our organization who'd come from Google, and they were saying that they left Google to work with us. And they were saying this in a way, as though that was an extraordinary thing. What I would love to hear, is that we get this right, so that in a couple of years' time, it is not an unexpected thing. And I think we could do that with values, and I think about being clear around strategy as well. And I think that applies to many of us, frankly.
Mandy, I think you have something.
Yeah, I agree largely with Leon. I think what's difficult, though, is with that set of choices, we're going to continue to attract people who can afford to make those choices. You're going to make decisions about working for a company that you feel good about if you can afford to. So the socioeconomic factors that we haven't really addressed it head on, but you've been referencing it several times. Yeah. So if we don't tackle that pay issue, then we are going to continue to see people go where they need to go in terms of the pay. And I think that's something that it's a real challenge. Of course, I'm sure every organisation in the room would love to pay what the tech companies are paying, and we can't afford to in many cases. But it is something we're going to have to think about how we address, because otherwise we're going to continue to attract people from the same socio-economic groups.
Right, which is a vicious circle
Absolutely.
in terms of diversity and inclusiveness. I think we had another question on the floor, right here on the left.
Mark Carden from Mosaic Search. I'm a headhunter, so I'm kind of at the pointy end of some of these in the recruitment area, at least. I've got so many questions I'd like to ask the panel, but I'll pick one. Mandy touched on positive discrimination as a tool for improving diversity and some of the dangers of that and some of the ways to do positive discrimination in shortlists for not hiring and things like that. But I wonder whether the other panel members wanted to say a word about positive discrimination and whether it can be used in recruitment, retention, development, various stages of the process in order to improve diversity, or whether the dangers of that are too great.
So Sonya, the question on the floor now, and I apologize for failing to repeat the last question. The question on the floor now is whether or not there is any role for positive diversity in helping to...
Positive discrimination.
Positive discrimination in helping to combat these issues regarding diversity and inclusiveness. Would anyone, Gemma, would you like to make a comment on that?
Sure, and my answer, I don't know if it will be satisfactory, is that I don't know. And my thoughts on this change on a regular basis, because I can see the pitfalls, and I know myself personally, I wouldn't want to get a job because I was female or because I was gay or whatever it is. I want to have a job based on the merits and my ability to do the job. That being said, and I think Mandy made a good point as well earlier about the effect that that has on other groups of society that you want to take on that diversity and inclusion journey with you. But there are, I think, cases where the diversity challenges are so great that sometimes drivers like positive discrimination are necessary or arguably can be helpful just to not level the playing field, but to help as part of a package to get you over to a certain point. So I changed my mind on that, but I hope that's okay.
I wonder if it could possibly be helpful with educating communities in that, creating exposure, and in that exposure and getting to the human level, helping people understand each other as people, and maybe that breaks down some barriers potentially. I don't know. Sonya, are you on? And if so, would you like to comment on this?
Sure. Yes, I'm here. Like Mandy, I don't have the answer, but my thoughts are that I think if we talk about positive discrimination in a vacuum, meaning that that's going to apply only to, certain groups of people, and not put it in the context, the historical context of, positive discrimination that has been going on that has not benefited women and, minority groups, et cetera, I think it becomes problematic. So, just talking about it now and saying it starts at T = 0 now, and now it's only going to apply to these groups with not putting it in a historical context may be just as problematic for the women, for minorities, and for the other groups as the quota system, because no one wants to feel like they got a job just because they were a member of a group. But in reality, that has happened, historically, but it's just not benefited the groups that I think these policies are trying to benefit and level the playing field for at this time.
It is an excellent point. I agree. That's why we're Skyping Sonya in. We're learning today. Mandy or Leon, would you like to weigh in on this, or no? Okay, great. We do have another question here. Renee, okay. Where are you going? Oh, we're coming up here.
Diverse and
okay.
Who gets a chance?
Who has a question? Heather? Okay, great.
Didn't mean to make you run so far. Hi, Heather Staines from Hypothesis. One of the great tools I think we have as an industry is the flexibility that's come from our being global enterprises, and a lot of the new technologies like that allow Sonya to join us today from another continent, that we have, given that it's more and more acceptable in the workplace for folks to have flexible and remote working arrangements, we can get some candidates who might not be able to, relocate as easily. And I think it ties back to the socioeconomic question, that you might not be able to afford to relocate to a San Francisco or to a London, but if you have an opportunity to take part in a workplace there, it opens the door for us to bring a wider range of folks in to participate in the organization. So I'm happy that there was a remote participation in the panel.
Very good. So I'm taking that as a comment more than a question, yes. But I think, yeah, very good. We do have another question down here, and so Heather was commenting, Sonya, on the importance of flexible work environments in promoting diversity and inclusion. And we have another question.
Yeah, I'm Jamie Axelrod from Northern Arizona University, and I spoke earlier on the accessibility of the products that everybody puts out there in terms of use by students. But most of those students that I work with, they actually would like to get a job at some point. So I wonder, as companies look at their infrastructure or their plans for diversity, do they take a look at the tools they're using in this highly technological sort of field nowadays as we're going forward to say, if we had employees with disabilities, could they actually use those tools? Are those tools that we employ accessible for them?
And your name is Jamie?
Jamie, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry that I missed your talk earlier, but actually, and I'm sorry that we didn't, because we, in the preparation, talked about persons with disabilities, and the question, Sonya, was whether or not the industry is thinking about both making their products, while they're thinking about making their products accessible to all types of folks, are they also thinking about employing people and and how to be thoughtful about employing people with disabilities. So does anybody have any comments on it? I think it's a great question. I'm glad it came up.
And Jamie, can I just say that I thought your presentation was one of the highlights of today, so it was a really great session.
So I missed a lot, obviously. I regret that.
And I found it very thought-provoking, because I don't think it's something we've talked about, and we've talked about it in preparation for this. But is our organisation and the industry doing enough? No, I don't think we are. When you were talking about the work that you do to make textbooks available for people with who are blind or visually impaired, we're clearly not doing anything like that to actually bring people into our organisations and help them work in our workplaces. And I think that's another layer of challenge that we need to think about. That's certainly from my perspective. I don't know if anybody's got a different view on it.
I'd agree. I think we're not doing enough, but I think that there are legislative frameworks that help to move us in the right direction. But I think it's not a positive discrimination issue as such as just actually having cognizance of it and actually thinking about how you enable people who would not necessarily see those opportunities, get those opportunities. So no, I think it's something that we're not picking up and doing enough of as an industry or even personally. But I think that, that there is a lot to do.
Agree. Speaking for my own company, I certainly agree. Any other thoughts? Sonya, do you have any thoughts on persons with disabilities in the workplace?
In a previous comment, I mentioned that it's important to include people with disabilities or differently abled people in recruitment and retention and inclusion efforts in employment. The issue is that a lot of times differently abled people, we depend on them to self-identify. So it's not always easy to know whether we're doing a good job or not, because many times it's not an obvious, we can't obviously say, okay, we have employed a person who is differently abled, and then also making the platforms accessible. I mean, it's the same issue. Gauging success sort of depends on the user to self-identify what their differently abled position is, and sometimes people are just not willing to do that.
Thank you. I believe we have come to the end of our time. Am I correct? Yes, we have. So I want to thank the panel, and I'd like to thank STM for having this discussion today, hosting this. I think that discussions like this are essential. Action is needed, but we've got to get to some common ground, and so I really want to thank STM for this, and please join me in thanking the panel.